When nations start making moves that even the United States can't control, the world takes notice. Something profound is shifting, and it's happening quietly, far from the spotlight of Washington. Canada and the Netherlands, two nations often overshadowed in the drama of global politics, are forging a partnership that could redefine the balance of power. This isn't just about trade agreements or diplomatic gestures, it's about a shared vision of resilience in a world that no longer revolves around a single superpower. As the US struggles to maintain its grip on global influence, these countries are proving that strategic independence is no longer a dream, it's a necessity. This alliance isn't born out of rebellion, but out of pragmatism. Both nations recognize that innovation, sustainability, and economic security cannot be dictated by the old playbook. They're writing new rules, and the most unsettling part for Washington is this: the US can't stop it. The question we must ask is not whether this partnership will succeed, but how much it will reshape the world order, and what that means for the future of American dominance. The first thing we need to understand is this: power today is no longer measured by the number of troops you command or the sheer size of your economy. It is measured by how independently you can act without collapsing under the weight of external pressure. That is what Canada and the Netherlands have recognized, and it's precisely what the United States underestimated. For decades, Washington operated under an illusion of permanence. The belief was simple. Alliances would hold because the US was the anchor, the indispensable power, the gravitational force that kept everyone in orbit. But here's the truth: gravity weakens as distance grows. And today, the distance between America's priorities and the priorities of its allies has never been greater. Canada and the Netherlands aren't breaking ties out of hostility. They're doing it out of necessity. They see a future where depending entirely on US leadership is a vulnerability, not a strength. This is not just a geopolitical maneuver, it is a psychological shift. Think about it. For years, smaller nations internalized the narrative that their security, their economy, their very identity on the world stage depended on staying within America's shadow. But as the global landscape evolves, energy transitions, supply chain disruptions, climate crisis, those same nations have realized that reliance is a form of weakness. Autonomy has become the highest form of power, and the US, it still operates under the assumption that influence is permanent, that allies will tolerate being secondary actors in a play written in Washington. But the truth is, no one wants to play a role in someone else's story forever. Canada and the Netherlands want to write their own chapters, ones that reflect their values, their ambitions, their realities. And in doing so, they are quietly signaling to the rest of the world the era of unilateral dominance is over. Here's the most critical point: this isn't a betrayal. It's evolution. When nations grow, they seek agency. And if the US cannot adapt to a world where leadership is shared rather than imposed, it will find itself not just losing allies, but losing relevance. Strategic independence is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of survival in a world that refuses to stand still. And so the question is not whether this shift is good or bad for America. The question is, will America learn from it, or will it cling to the illusion of control until the last thread of influence slips away? Remember this: power is never a gift, it is a relationship, and relationships, when taken for granted, eventually break. One of the most dangerous assumptions in international politics is that history alone is enough to sustain alliances. For decades, the bond between the US and its closest partners was celebrated as unbreakable because it was rooted in shared victories, shared values, and shared struggles from the past. But here's a reality check: memory doesn't pay the bills, and nostalgia doesn't solve the crises of tomorrow. Alliances are not monuments, they are living, breathing arrangements that demand constant renewal through relevance. What Canada and the Netherlands understand, what many US strategists fail to grasp, is that alliances anchored only in historical sentiment will eventually decay. Why? Because nations act in self-interest, and self-interest evolves. The priorities that once united these nations, Cold War security, economic globalization under an American umbrella, are not the priorities driving decisions today. Today the game has changed. Climate resilience, technological sovereignty, energy security, and equitable trade have replaced ideological confrontation as the markers of progress and survival. And let's be brutally honest, Washington has not kept pace. While the US is still wrestling with internal polarization and projecting a vision of leadership rooted in dominance, its allies are moving toward a model of distributed influence. Networks rather than hierarchies, cooperation rather than coercion. They're asking a fundamental question: does aligning too closely with the US serve our long-term interests, Or does it tether us to a system increasingly defined by unpredictability and conflict? Canada and the Netherlands teaming up is not an act of defiance. It's a strategic recalibration. They're saying, we still value you, America, but we will no longer subordinate our future to your inertia. This is not betrayal, it's realism. When shared history stops translating into shared benefits, nations pivot toward shared opportunities. And those opportunities increasingly are global and decentralized. They involve building partnerships on renewable energy, advanced AI governance, sustainable trade networks. Issues where the U.S. no longer holds an uncontested advantage. This is where the philosophical dimension comes in. Nations, like people, define relationships based on reciprocity, not just sentimentality. A friendship where one party dominates the conversation will eventually fracture, no matter how many photographs sit in the family album. For too long, the U.S. assumed that emotional capital, the gratitude of past wars, the symbolism of old treaties would outweigh the hard calculations of the present. That assumption is unraveling. The lesson here is stark: history is a foundation, not a fortress. You cannot live inside it forever. If America wants to maintain influence, it must make itself indispensable not to the past, but to the future. Otherwise, shared history will become a story everyone remembers but no one chooses to keep writing. And that is the truth too many in Washington refuse to confront. In a world defined by constant disruption, loyalty is not inherited. It is earned. Every single day. If you strip away the rhetoric, the flags, the lofty speeches about freedom and partnership, what really binds nations together today? It's economics. Not as a cold, detached calculation but as the central engine of survival, influence, and growth. Trade agreements, investment flows, energy dependencies. These shape the real balance of power far more than any shared anthem or ceremonial handshake. And when you look at Canada and the Netherlands, this new reality becomes crystal clear. Both nations have recognized that economic security is national security. This is not just about GDP growth, it's about building systems resilient enough to withstand shocks. Pandemics, climate disasters, supply chain breakdowns, and yes, even geopolitical bullying. They're choosing partnerships that reflect this understanding. They see that a rigid dependence on one dominant partner, the United States, introduces a structural weakness. If that partner falters or shifts policy based on domestic political turbulence, the ripple effects are devastating. We've seen glimpses of this before, and nobody wants to repeat that cycle. Now, look at the sectors where Canada and the Netherlands are aligning: renewable energy infrastructure, advanced technology, agricultural innovation, and digital trade. These are not symbolic collaborations, they're strategic hedges against a future where resource scarcity, technological monopolies, and economic coercion will define the global game. And here's the irony: by pooling their resources and expertise, they actually create more leverage, even over Washington, than either country could alone. This is where the U.S. should be paying attention. The old model of economic dominance, the idea that America could dictate the rules of global commerce, has expired. Today, power is distributed through networks, through nodes of influence rather than a single hub. And in this networked reality, cooperation beats hierarchy every time. Canada and the Netherlands are not just trading goods, they're trading futures, embedding their economies into a fabric that prioritizes sustainability, shared governance, and innovation. Let's not ignore the psychology at play here. Nations, like individuals, are drawn to relationships that make them feel secure, respected, and empowered. Economic partnerships provide that sense of agency, something that many U.S. allies feel they've lost in the orbit of Washington's unpredictability. By creating diversified ties, Canada and the Netherlands are reclaiming their autonomy while still staying inside the Western Alliance framework. They're not breaking the circle, they're redrawing its center of gravity. And here's the deeper truth: in the 21st century, economic alignment is not just a question of prosperity, it's a question of sovereignty. Who you trade with determines who you depend on, and dependence in a world of uncertainty is vulnerability. Canada and the Netherlands are refusing to remain vulnerable. The lesson here is as sharp as it is simple. Those who fail to adapt to the economics of tomorrow will find themselves negotiating from weakness, not strength. And in geopolitics, weakness is a luxury no nation can afford. If there's one truth that the modern era keeps hammering home, it's this: the old architecture of power, rigid, hierarchical, dominated by a single hegemon, is collapsing under the weight of complexity. We live in an interconnected world where no nation, no matter how mighty, can dictate the course of history alone. Power today isn't about ownership, it's about participation. And that is precisely what alliances like the one between Canada and the Netherlands signal: a profound recognition that influence is now distributed, not centralized. Think about it. For decades, global order functioned like a pyramid, with the United States at its peak, issuing directives that others largely followed. But pyramids are fragile structures, they depend on the illusion that the base will always support the top. What we're seeing now is a shift towards something far more resilient, a network. In a network, power is shared across nodes, and no single node can claim absolute control. The collaboration between Canada and the Netherlands is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of adaptation to this new geometry of power. This evolution carries a psychological dimension too. Nations no longer aspire to simply align with a superpower, they want agency, equality, and mutual respect. When Canada partners with the Netherlands on technology or green infrastructure, it's not merely about trade. It's about shaping a future where smaller powers aren't perpetually at the mercy of larger ones. It's a statement that security and prosperity can be co-created without submitting to a monopolistic model of influence. The philosophical implications here are enormous. For centuries, the story of human governance has been the story of centralization, kingdoms, empires, superstates. But nature, the ultimate teacher, favors ecosystems over empires. Ecosystems thrive on interdependence, diversity, and balance. That's where geopolitics is heading. The more the global order starts to resemble an ecosystem instead of a pyramid, the more resilient it becomes. And Canada and the Netherlands are quietly writing that chapter. Now, this doesn't mean conflict disappears. Networks can compete just as fiercely as empires did. But the competition shifts from raw dominance to innovation, cooperation, and adaptability. The nations that understand this will flourish. Those that cling to the myth of absolute control will exhaust themselves fighting ghosts of a world that no longer exists. Here's the hard truth for Washington. If it continues to view these partnerships as threats rather than opportunities, it will isolate itself in a system that no longer revolves around a single center. The future is polycentric, not unilateral. That's not a loss of power, it's a redistribution of it, and those who embrace this reality will lead in ways that raw force never could. So ask yourself this: in a world where no one owns the future, how do you choose to participate? Because that choice, not the illusion of dominance, will define the next era of global history.